And our next speaker is no other than Dr. Franz Ruppert himself. He is a retired professor of psychology at the University of Applied Sciences in Munich and an internationally recognized speaker and trauma researcher. Over the past 30 years, he has developed the theory of identity-oriented psychotrauma theory and the practical method of IoPT, the intention method. So let's give a warm hand to Dr. Franz Ruppert. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria, for this introduction, and thank you very much to everyone who is engaged in organizing this conference. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, all of others who have contributed to this event. Yeah, and I also may say thank you to Kamsi Gunnar Ratnam. I was very impressed by her speech and the thoughts she has. And I mean, this clearly shows how important it is that if you want to understand trauma and the many dimensions that are involved with trauma, you need to also look at yourself, to look at your personality, you look at your life career, you look at what happened to you during your lifespan. And I think if you're open to that, then in many cases maybe you understand that there were some events or there's still something that can affect you. And so this is, I think, one of the bases also of our work, that we do not hesitate also to look at our own biography and see what happened to us, and that we are open for that, and that we are not only the experts for us, but others, but we are, first of all, we become expert for ourselves, understanding our biography, and then out of this, I think we can also be open for the biography of our clients and patients, and support them as best as possible with our knowledge. Traveling from Munich to Oslo yesterday, at the airport, I bought this book. Maybe some of you know it, The Myth of Normal from Gabor Mate. I highly recommend this book, of course, but maybe it's not necessary when it is already in the bookshop in the airport. Then this is a good sign for how popular Gabor Mate's books are, and it's absolutely good that it is like this. And in this book, he quotes Peter Levine, and with this phrase, "Trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering." And and to change this and to do something in order to make trauma more aware and take it out of the situation where people are afraid of it, of this, trauma, maybe this is the worst case that can happen, but to make it possible to talk about trauma and see how widespread it is and how normal, in a way, trauma can be. And this is also, I think, one of the purposes of Gabor Mate's book, to normalize what is trauma, in the sense that we say it's not an exception from the rule, and it happens very often and can affect many of us. And and this is what we are doing here, to understand what trauma is, to get a clear understanding, not to overstretch also this concept, because not every event and not every burden we carry, or everything that is not nice for us is already traumatizing. But but maybe there is more trauma than we would expect it in the first glance. So trauma and identity is the topic of my lecture, and also the question how much trauma also can cross generation and can be a transgenerational phenomenon too. So the agenda of my lecture is, first of all, I make some comments on what is psychotrauma in general, then how we can define identity, and what is the connection between trauma and identity. And as the last point, I give some of my insights about transgenerational trauma and how I understand it, and how we find some ideas about it in literature. First thing is to define trauma. It's not easy to do this, but there are some attempts, and for me, the prominent attempt is from a German textbook about psychotraumatology from Gottfried Fischer and Peter Riedesser. It is from the year 2000 about, and they write, a trauma is a vital experience of discrepancy between threatening situational factors and the individual coping capacities that is associated with emotions of helplessness and the lacking of any protection, thus creating a permanent instability of the self-concept and the conception of the world. Yeah, let's reflect on that to understand it. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, okay. So again, I read it again because you couldn't read it. A vital experience of discrepancy between threatening situational factors. That is vital. Vital. It has to do with our life. It has to do with our physical existence, but as well with our psychological well-being. With the question, how much can I go on with my life if something happens to me that has such a deep emotional effect? On the one side, we have the situation, and on the other side, we have our coping capacities. This, of course, means that our coping capacities also depends from our development. It depends from our age. It depends of our social status. Yeah? So the coping, every one of us has a different type of coping capacities, and so not every situation affects the people in the same way. So it depends from our coping capacities. And then next point is that is associated with emotions of helplessness and the lacking of any protection. So trauma is about, one very important thing about trauma is the emotions, that we are in a state of emotion, that we are full of fear, we are full of anger, we are full of shame, we are full of disgust, all those emotions that are unbearable, that we can't deal with it. And we can't do anything to protect us, the lacking of any protection. That means that we, of course, in a trauma situation, you can try to do something, to fight or to escape from it. But if this is not possible, if it's not possible for you to avoid the situation, then you end up in a state, how they write, creating a permanent instability of the self-concept. It means that you are that you are aware, I cannot protect myself. There was no way to do it. And this has not only in the moment, a consequence for the moment, then this has a consequence, a long-lasting consequence, that you make the experience, I cannot protect myself, and maybe it could happen again and again. And this is the next point of the definition, this to create a permanent instability in yourself and how you see the world. And to see the world as something that is dangerous, that could hurt you, that could do harm to you, or also do harm to your beloved ones. It's not only about yourself, but also if you observe that somebody else was traumatized and was hurt, that then you do not see the world any longer as a safe place, and you're afraid. You're afraid, in a way. You can say you're afraid of yourself, what's going on in yourself. You can't cope with this, and you're afraid on the outside. You're afraid from what's happening in the inside, and you're afraid what's happening in the outside, and somehow maybe you even can't distinguish it. What is in the inside, what's in the outside? The clear distinction, that's me and that is the outside world, that can get lost by trauma. Another definition I will want to show you here says psychological trauma means any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behavior, and other aspects of functioning. Also here, this is trauma very often has to be with fear, with panic, with anxieties, with this state of I can't do anything, I'm helpless, I'm lost. And then you dissociate. Then dissociation means you cannot stay with, you cannot deal with what's going on, and you have to go away. You have to give up the contact with reality, and you end up in a state of confusion and very intense feelings that are not over when the situation is over. Because normally, what would be a normal situation, you are you experience something, you have emotions about this, and when the situation is over, also the emotions can calm down. But with trauma, it's not possible. The emotions, you stay in this state of being overwhelmed, being over too many fears, too many rage, too much shame that results from the situation and it doesn't finish inside you. Then the second part of this definition, traumatic events include those caused by human behavior, for example, rape, war, industrial accidents, as well as by nature, for example, earthquakes, and often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. It's also just that you are expecting in a society, the society you live in or the family you live in, that what is happening there is just. Everyone has the right to be, and everyone has his rights. And with trauma, you make the experience of injustice. Something it's not right. Yeah? And of course, then looking for justice is also something that is connected with trauma for many people. And another definition I give you here for what trauma means, that trauma always has to do with stress. With trauma, the trauma situations, they start with a stressful situation. And this life experience becomes not only stressful but traumatic if we face a risk for our body and are incapable of dealing with it with the help of our stress programs. Because normally, if we are in a situation where we feel endangered, where something is attacking us, then we have these stress programs to protect us. But when we are not able to, even if our stress programs are activated, we are not able to escape from this situation, and we realize that the situation gets even more worse for us when we act with our stress programs. For example, if we run away or we are going to fight, then we come to the point where something extra must happen in order to survive the situation. And our stress programs make the situation even worse for us, and therefore we end up in a state of helplessness and agony, and the stress programs has to be stopped and suppressed. It's the same time as if it's such a contradictory situation that on the one side your body is activated to the extreme, and at the same time you have to press it down, suppress it. You have to get out this energy of your body and to stop these processes that are going on, and this is a huge internal conflict. And how to solve this, I will show you soon, how to solve this conflict between highly activated and at the same time you don't dare to do anything, and you must be completely stop all of your activities. So the traumatic process, you can see, consists in the end out of the traumatizing situation. It's what's going on in the outside. Then experience the trauma, what's going on inside you, and then the short, medium, and long-term consequences of a trauma. What happens immediately with you, then sometimes maybe with some time passing on, maybe you seem to recover from this actual situation, but after a week, or you just start to feel uneasy, you can't sleep, you have somatic symptoms, you have headaches, and all those things that show that maybe for a moment you could escape from the situation, but something is going on inside yourself. And then we have also the long-term consequences of a trauma that can result then, because you are stressed so much all the time, chronic stress is in yourself, then in the end this can also lead to severe injury, to severe illnesses, or, and what we also see as long-term consequences of trauma, the trauma can be passed on also in the next generation. This is also one of the aspects of the long-term consequences of trauma, that those who are traumatized, if they are in close contact with somebody else, this trauma can be transferred to somebody else, and this is specifically the risk when we have the family situation, when the parents are traumatized, and the risk is that their children are involved in this unresolved trauma of the parents. Yeah, so trauma, you can say, is an injury of your physical body, is an injury of the psyche, and in the end, what's very important also for us as human beings, it's an injury of social relations, because we are social animals in a way, you can say. And so if I am traumatized, this also affects my relationship with others, and the closer the relationship is, the more maybe this has an effect on another person. And this also has effects in how I myself am able to relate with somebody else. So the general consequences of a trauma are, there's just some symptoms: hyperarousal and hypervigilance. You're always in this internal state, so you can't calm down. It's very difficult to recover, and for example, sleeping problems, difficulties can also just result from that. Then the extreme anxieties and panic also can be a consequence. Permanent feeling of helplessness, hopelessness, and sadness, and this, of course, can also then result in depressive modes, and maybe even in a major depression. Then numbing of feelings. In order to protect yourself from all these overwhelming feelings, we have a coping mechanism available in us, in our psyche, that helps us to survive the situation by numbing our feelings. And this, of course, has consequences also for the joy of life. Yeah? If you can't feel, if you're not able to feel what you experience, then this is a big issue for enjoying life, because I suppress my anxieties, I suppress my sadness, but at the same time, by the numbing of the feelings, I also impress joy and good feelings. What you also observe as a consequence of trauma is the intrusion of the traumatic situation in the world, in my mind. That sometimes there is maybe a sound, sometimes you have a smell or a taste, or sometimes there's a picture showing up inside you, and immediately it can immediately happen that you are again in this traumatizing situation. And so, in a way, this also leads to the situation that you are afraid of yourself. Yeah? First you need to. There was something, you have to be afraid of what's happening outside. And then you end up in a state that you're afraid of your own psyche. You don't feel safe with your own psyche. And this also can end up in avoidance behavior. Yeah, you rather withdraw than you are open for what's happening and looking for life experiences. And because you're, for example, if you suffer from panic attacks, and for you it's always a risk to leave the house or to be in contact with other people, because you are afraid that the panic can show up immediately and you can't do anything about it, and maybe you feel ashamed for that you have these panic attacks, and so you withdraw. You withdraw from your relationships and stay at home as long as possible. Also, what can be a general consequence of trauma is that we have this extreme anger and rage, because something happened, was done to you, and this caused to you anger and rage, but the situation is over, and the person that maybe has triggered this anger and rage inside you is not there, and so it can happen that you express this anger and rage towards somebody else who is innocent, who didn't do anything to you. And so people are afraid of you. People are afraid of you, that you could attack them even if they did not do anything to you, even maybe they love you, and but you can't control this anger and can't control your rage. And so in the end, you also lose your best friend by these trauma reactions. What we also can observe is extreme feelings of shame, of disgust. As a consequence, this has maybe very often to do also with when your body limits were transgressed, and somebody did some harm to you on the body level, and then you have this permanent feelings of shame or disgust inside you. And this also makes it difficult for you to make good contact and also good body contact with somebody else. Yeah, feelings of unreality can be observed. Then somatization, this is a wide field that trauma can express itself in many body symptoms and illnesses. And what also important is that by being traumatized, we can lose our bonding capacities, or they can be reduced. That our capacity to bond with other human beings is very reduced, because every feeling brings me in a state, could bring me again in a state of overwhelm, and so I reduce my connection with other people. And I think this is very important to understand this, that one of the most significant consequences of a trauma can be an inability to manage bonding relations without stress. And as we know that these bonding relations are so important, especially between parents and their children, then this has, of course, a huge effect for the life of parents and the life of children. Because if you, as a child, you see you want, as a child, of course, you want to bond, to have a safe bond with your parents, and if you see that you bond, the parents are stressed in contact with you, for you as a child, in a way you're confused and do not understand what's really going on, and then you think something wrong with you. That children think that something is wrong with them. And because of course, they do not understand what happened to their parents. So, altogether, we can see that there is a trauma emergency mechanism that is necessary for us to survive trauma situations. And on the level of the body, we have this immobilization of the body, that we can move, we are in a state of being frozen. Then on the level of our feelings, that our feelings are freezing, and our mind we are dissociating and altogether we can say the structure of our psyche can be split, that this emergency mechanism also can end up in this situation that we have no longer fully access to all our psychological capacities, and we need to split our psyche in order to survive. All this is necessary to survive trauma situations. And this is one of the basic models we have in IoPT, that we say maybe before the traumatizing experience, we are whole, our psyche is working, all the functions of our psyche are probably working together. But then when we have experienced trauma, or we are constantly in trauma situations, we need to split our psyche in order to survive. And the good message always is that we do not lose completely our healthy psyche. We have still what I call healthy part available for us. But on the other side, there are also the traumatized parts in our psyche. And in order to survive the situations, we have developed our survival strategies. So altogether, in our psyche, there is a structure, a split structure. And sometimes if we are triggered, something triggers us, we immediately go in our surviving strategies and are not capable to deal with this situation with our healthy parts. So there are different types of trauma. The one type of trauma we call shock trauma, that, for example, have to do with the trauma, what I call the trauma of existential threat, for example, being involved in a life-threatening event, a car accident, or an assassination attempt. And the other shock trauma is that we lose somebody, we lose a person to whom we are deeply bonded. For example, when parents losing an own child, this is a very existential trauma, and is what we call the trauma of loss. On the other side, we have those long-lasting relational traumas. The trauma, what I call in IoPT theory, I call the trauma of love. It means I'm rejected, or a person is rejected by the person one needs to bond to. On this, one of the most prominent examples is if a child feels rejected by his mother, not being loved by the mother in the way the child does need it. Of course, it also depends from the age of the child, and this is a very severe experience of not having enough emotional contact with somebody, and this is something you can't bear, and that makes it necessary for you to also to go in the state of split off the pain of not being seen and not being loved. And then we do have another situation I call the traumatization of a bonding system, where we have the situation that there are constantly permanent victim dynamics in a bonding system, for example in a family, and they are caused by violence, incest, or murder. And the question is, how can I stay and can I be in such a system? And the only way, of course, is then that you split, and sometimes also the only way is that you become yourself, not only being the victim in such a system, but also starting to become a perpetrator in such a system. So we can say that every type of trauma, of the shock trauma, relational trauma, whatever type of trauma it is, has a specific set of symptoms on the physical level, an emotional level, on a cognitive level, and on a behavioral level. And the different types of trauma are also correlated with typical surviving strategy. For example, if there's a trauma of loss, I'm working in the moment with a man who has lost his son by a car accident many years ago, and one of these surviving strategies is to keep this son alive in his psyche, in his mind, as best as possible. It does everything in a way to keep this, to avoid to realize that this boy is dead. He just is not longer alive. And so this is how he tries to survive this event that was so terrible for him, to observe that his son was killed by in a car accident. So in IoPT, we work with the concept of the trauma biography, and there are different states of this trauma biography. On the one of the basic states we call the trauma of identity, and this trauma of identity also can be connected with what we call the trauma of love. Out of this also it can happen that somebody who is not wanted, who is not loved, that also suffers from violence and maybe also from sexual violence. And on the top of this trauma biography, it can happen that we become a perpetrator ourselves, that we are not only the victim of trauma, but also become perpetrators. And though there's what they call the trauma trias, not being wanted, not being loved, and it also can happen that we are not protected. So this is what I want to share here about trauma in general. Of course, you can say many things more, but I want to put the focus also here on trauma and identity and the connection between trauma and identity. So the next step is to talk about what is identity. Identity, I have here a definition of it. Identity, Latin idem, the same, describes the way in which people perceive and understand themselves from the biographical development in the constant confrontation with their social environment. Important determinants that enter into the constitution of one's own identity are, for example, gender, age, and social origin, ethnicity, nationality, and group membership, occupation and social status, but also personal characteristics and competences. And we see this a very complex term, identity. The question for me, if we put it into a question, the question is who I am, and what is me, and what is important for me to know who I am. And so I try to define also identity in such a way that I say, in the end, my identity is the sum of all my life experiences and how I did respond to them. And this, of course, includes everything that is pleasant for me, but on the other side, I also have to take into account that I could be traumatized, I could have experienced trauma, and so to understand who I am and to know myself who I am, it's also necessary for me to be open for the fact that maybe traumatizing experience, about the traumatizing experience I have made. So it means I can't leave anything out of if I want to know who I am. Because maybe sometimes people say, okay, I don't want to look back, I don't want to go back in my biography or look at my childhood this long time ago, and I don't want to deal with it any longer or anymore. But I think if you really want to know who you are, it's necessary that you're aware of the whole biography and what happened from the very beginning of your life, to understand yourself maybe, and also understanding psychological symptoms, body symptoms, how you react in relationships. And so I have tried to make a definition about what a healthy identity could mean. So I equal I. What does it mean? For me it means I do have available a healthy I. I do have available my own free will. I can make decisions. I'm not determined by what's going on in the outside or by the expectation of others. I can make my free decisions. I in contact with all my senses, I'm in contact with my body, I'm in contact with all my feelings. I don't need to avoid the feelings that showing up. I find my own words to express myself and express what's going on, what I observe in the outside. And this is true in all my relationships. To be yourself, in contact with your free will, with your perceptions, in contact with your body, feelings and thoughts. And this is something that maybe it's not easy to reach, to come to the point when there is trauma in the background. And therefore, of course, we need to explore our biography if there is something that prevents us from being really in contact with all of us, with everything that's going on inside us. And you understand who am I, and have to look at myself in my development. How did I develop? What was going on from the very beginning when I came into existence? And it means I have to take into account what could have happened when my mother conceived me, what happened during this time when she was pregnant with me, what happened in the birth process, what happened immediately after birth, and what happened in those phases of my life when there is still no consciousness. But it belongs to me. It's an important part of my psyche. And so it's important that we have a closer look to it and see if there also are risks for traumatization in this early states of our development. This is the concept of early trauma that we have in IoPT, and this is something very important, that we understand how a human being can develop and what can happen in this early stage of our life. So we can say that the human child exists immediately after conception as a unique organism, also developing her own unique psyche. The psyche does not develop only after birth. It's just from the very beginning our psyche is developing with our body. And the child develops as a subject and is an individuum, that means not divided, as long as he does not become traumatized. The risk of being traumatized is there from the very beginning. And at the beginning we have a felt sense of being I, and this in this time we become more and more self-aware. There is a process that of self-awareness from we could say maybe on a daily basis, and because the development also goes quite quickly, and though also the development of the understanding who I am starts from the very beginning. So the child learns through his own actions that I can influence and change my environment by my intention and my will. This is something that starts from the very beginning already during the time of the pregnancy, being in the womb of the mother. And the development of self-awareness, you can say, is from the beginning connected with being in relation with the mother, because she is the first person we have a relation, and so the child develops the I in relation to the I of the mother. And normally, if everything goes well, the child can develop healthily. After 2 years, the child will already have a distinct and conscious self-concept. And when the child is 2 or 3 years old, he's able to use personal pronouns correctly, like me, mine, yours. And on the other side, if the I of the mother is clearly perceptible for the child, this will also support the development of the child's understanding of who am I. If not, this can, from the very beginning, can cause identity insecurities or even identity disorders for him. So the relation with the mother is, as we see here also in our practical processes, if we do trauma therapy, then we see how much the clearness of who am I depends also from the clearness who clear is the mother with her own eye, and how much the mother is in her own healthy eye. There is some brain research that shows us this capacity to know who you are, and has also to do with your prefrontal cortex. And I quote here Joachim Bauer. He's quite famous in Germany, and I hope his books are also translated in different languages. So, and he writes, as self-control is a process organized in the prefrontal cortex, the conclusion is that there are also internal images of the I, and similarly internal pictures of others. This we have in our brain, and this is maybe specifically also for us human beings. We have the capacity to develop a very distinct concept: who am I and who are the others? And the development of a felt I or self and an inner image of another has to take place in the brain of the baby, and these two processes are interwoven from the beginning. So I think brain research also supports the idea that this knowing who I am is a process that goes on from the very beginning of our life. A second term that seems for me to be important to understand is identification, in order to know what means identity and what means healthy identity. Because by the process of identification, it's not I am I, but is the equivalent is I am you, or I is we. I identify it with something that comes from outside. And so we can say the development of I is embedded in the development of the psychological categories of us and we. And the first we is I and my mother. And further identity of we are I and my father, I and my brother, sister, I and my family, I and my friends, I'm later on in life, I and my colleagues, I'm my husband, my wife, I'm my children, and so on. There's a constant need for us also to identify with us, and identify us with something that is outside of us. And at the beginning of our development, what's outside us, we take it as granted, as if it's natural that I'm a part of something outside of me, and we accept those offers to be we, to belong to something, to some communities. We take it without questions. Only later in life we can freely choose between different offers of we. To whom and to which group of humans do I really want to belong? And we have seen, but those people have to leave maybe their home countries and are refugees. For them, it's something that a huge challenge to say, now I'm no longer belong to this original group where I come from, but now I try to belong to somebody else, to some other groups. So if we look at this process of identification and identity under the perspective of our needs, then we can say that the fulfillment of our symbiotic necessities, like being nurtured, by being kept warm, having body contact, being held, having eye contact, being understood, being supported, belonging exclusively to another person, being welcomed, this support the identification of the child with a we. On the other hand, our desires for autonomy, like to perceive, to feel, to think for yourself, to be independent, to find balance in yourself, to rely on your abilities to act, to be and feel free, to decide for yourself, this supports the distinction of the child from the we. So we have maybe always a conflict. Do I lose the support from outside? Do I lose what I need as support from others if I'm autonomous, if I act out my autonomous needs? And this maybe is a lifelong conflict for every one of us. On the one side, we want to belong. On the other side, also we want to be ourselves and have our own ideas, have our own way of living, and have our own choices. So the identification through all our life are very many. We have many options to identify with something in the outside. For example, the sports teams from our home countries, the region we live, the company in which we work, the stars from sports, movies, and music industries, fantasy figures, or also values in our societies. And the question always is, do such identifications support or hinder the development of a healthy identity? And do they cause a distraction from developing your own healthy I? So this is the tension between a good and healthy identification and those identifications where you could lose yourself because you just want to fulfill the expectations from others and you forget about your own needs. A third term that seems important for me in this theory about identity is what I call attribution. What does it mean, attribution? Attribution means you am I and you and me. I tell you who you are and somebody else tells me who I should be. And there are different ways and forms of attributions. For example, of course, the name we are given, our name, is an attribution to us. We do not choose it. In the beginning, we do not choose it ourselves. And maybe if you have a name from a relative in the family who has had something that could have happened to this person. For example, during war times, there was a brother of my mother that was killed in the war, and then now I'm giving the name of this brother. This has already some meaning, because maybe when my mother looks at me and calls out my name, she is reminded on her own brother that was killed in the war, and so this also can affect her relationship to me. Maybe sometimes I'm confused when she is sad, looking at me because she does not see me, but she sees maybe her deceased brother. Attributing attitudes to someone, attribute can also be something that comes from outside and they tell you who you are, but in a way you're maybe irritated. Why do I get those attributions? Religions are attributions, and in the end, of course, also nationalities are attributions, declaring someone as a German, British, Norwegian citizen. It comes from outside, and it's nothing natural inside a person. And the same political attributions, you are my ally, you are my enemy, or you are a terrorist. Something that comes from outside, and it's always the question if it's really true. The attribution that is given to someone, is this really true about this person? So we can say that attributions, they include and exclude. They create the necessity for belonging to a group, but can also put pressure on human beings to fulfill the expectation from those who give me these attributions. And they can enforce idealization on one side and devaluation also on the other side. Attribution also can increase competition, they can create pictures of enemies, and they can limit the space for developing one's own healthy identity. So we have these three categories: identity, identification, and attribution. And the question is, do the identifications and attributions support the healthy development of a healthy identity, or do they block it and do they hinder us from developing ourselves, who we really are? And then the next question is, what does psychotrauma do to my identity? And there is something that is what I have observed, that seems very important, that having to give up one's healthy I and free will in order to survive extreme and permanent violence and rejection. So I can't be myself. I'm not allowed to be myself because I'm not wanted, I'm rejected. And so I need to, this has a huge impact on how I perceive myself and how I behave. And this rejection, that I'm not wanted, I'm rejected, I should not be there, this can happen very early, in a very early stage of our development, by the fact that we are not wanted by our own mother or our own father. Or I should not be at all, or not as I am. And this has huge consequences for our trauma surviving strategies. Then we need to identify with the perpetrators, with the rejection, for example, from mother and father, and we perceive ourselves as being wrong. Something's wrong with me, not something wrong with this, how I am seen, but it's wrong. I myself am wrong. And this also produces the need for looking for substitute identities, for example, for a professional role. I'm now trying to be somebody who is there for others and not for myself. And this also produces the tendency to accept those attributions that's coming from outside without questions. And this also makes very difficult that you live your own healthy identity. And this is then what we call in IoPT the trauma of identity, that you can't be yourself and you do not allow yourself to be who you really are. So then we come to the next step, the concept of this transgenerational trauma. There are other terms like intergenerational trauma, cross-generational trauma, multi-generational trauma. And the basic idea is that trauma does not only influence the life of a traumatized individual, but also can affect the life of the children and grandchildren of this person. And this also the trauma can also have a huge impact on whole communities. So transgenerational trauma is the psychological and physiological effects that the trauma experienced by people has on subsequent generation in that group. The primary mode of transmission is shared family environment of the infant, causing psychological, behavioral, and social changes in the individual. This is a definition of transgenerational trauma. And we do have different examples for the transgenerational trauma. One example, and there's done a lot of research about this, is what happens to those who survived the Holocaust in the family, what happened to them. And another example is families that have survived wars and escape. A third example is the progenies of enslaved families and victims of racism. The fourth is indigenous people that had to suffer from colonialism, expulsion, and forced assimilation. And the fifth example is victims of political persecution. And for each of them, this transgenerational trauma has different consequences. For example, Holocaust survivors and the families. What we have found, what in research has found out, that those who survived the Holocaust very often have this, so what is called the survivor's guilt. Why did I survive when others had to die? And I can't enjoy my life because of others had to suffer so much. There in these families, it was observed that there's excessive fear of loss, and sometimes they have great difficulties to distinguish between real and irrational threats. What's really threatening us, or what is just the memory from the past. And there are strong conflicts of loyalties within the family. For example, if you are from a Jewish family and you have your child in a Jewish family, and maybe you are looking for a partner, and then you find a partner. For now, let's take it the example from Germany. You have a German friend, a girl in a Jewish family is mating with a boy from a German background. This may cause huge loyalty conflicts, and how can you do? The parents may think, how can you do it to us if the Germans have done so many harm to us, and now you are dealing with somebody from this hostile community. And yeah, there are examples for this, how much conflicts this can produce in such families. And there's also an over-identification of the children with the suffering of the parents, because the children know that the parents suffer, and how can I be happy and can have a happy life when my parents are suffering so much? I found a quote from something what's in an exhibition in the Jewish Museum in Munich. I find it very interesting. They don't suffer the same trauma. Those who have experienced it are forced on survival and know what they have to do to have survived is their victory. This is the generation that has suffered from the trauma, has suffered from Holocaust. The others, the next generation, they are clueless. They come into the world helpless, and an event waits on them that is not talked about. But the dimensions of which are so monstrous that they feel crushed by it and cannot help but measure everything by this cubit. And measured against it, nothing lasts, neither her life nor everything else. So this is now the next generation. How, in compared to what my parents have experienced, what does it matter what I am experiencing? How can I be important? Yeah? What makes some importance in my own life if this has happened to my parents? So what else can they do but look for an answer that they can't find? Yeah, you can't find your own identity in the mirror of such a huge event that your parents or your grandparents are suffering from. The next example is the transgenerational trauma of indigenous people, those who are forced to be part of the new society, like, for example, in Norway, those who were from the Sami communities, they were forced to become more and more Norwegian, and this also caused them to give up their own identity, give up the way how they live, and this produced in these communities chronic stress. We have here higher rates of violence, depression, and suicide. We have a high prevalence for alcohol and drug abuse, and this all ends up in identity conflicts and cultural alienation. You do not have your own cultural background any longer, but also you can't take it over what's offered from the dominant society. Another example for these transgenerational consequences of trauma is slavery and racism. In this, there are studies that show there is, in these communities, there's an increased susceptibility to stress. There's also a increased risk of mental illnesses in the subsequent generations. Another question of this transgenerational trauma is, what if my parents or grandparents are perpetrators? How can I deal with that? And there we find two tendencies. The one is you identify with the perpetrator values and attitudes. So that means you protect your relatives from being accused, and you say maybe it's not true what is told about them. Or the other thing is that you feel guilty, you feel ashamed, and try to atone. We see both mechanisms that are going on there. So what are the psychological mechanisms to transfer trauma? I think the most important thing is that the relationship between parents and children. Many traumatized parents avoid talking about their experiences. We have this silence, that there's something not spoken out. And the silence makes the children feel that something is wrong. And the children take over, identify with unspoken feelings like anxieties, grief, rage, shame, or distrust. And this then can lead to anxiety disorders and identity insecurities. And there's a process well known in psychology that since many years, what we call parentification. Children of traumatized parents often take responsibility early on because they perceive the parents constantly suffering. They feel responsible for the well-being of the family, which can lead to chronic overwhelm. And the child feels left alone and not seen. This I've experienced in an individual work with a young woman last week, when she told me that she tried everything to keep the family together, to try to create a warm atmosphere and in her family, and this was not acknowledged by the parents, because the parents, out of their trauma, were not able to create this bonding, that safe bonding in the family that would have been necessary for her in order to focus on herself and her own development. So she always was looking, what can I do, what do I need to do for my parents in order to keep the family together. In the end, it of course was not successful, and the parents separated. Another good example for me is a movie from a German filmmaker who was constantly dreaming something about war. Even he was, of course, he was not himself in the war, and then he realized these dreams, they result not from his own experiences, but from somebody in his family. And the movie that he made, the documentary he made, is called "The War in Me." And I quote something from announcement of the film. He says, "How much soldier is still alive in me?" Sebastian Heinzel asked himself when he learns from the Wehrmacht archives that his grandfather fought in Russia during the Second World War. Grandpa Hans had never told his family about the mission. Inspired by these discoveries, the filmmaker travels to the places where his father was stationed as a soldier. He encounters unexpected connection to his own life and to his war dreams, which have been haunting him for decades. As Sebastian gets deeper into the search, he gets his father involved, which breaks a silence that has blanketed his father and brings the two closer together. The film shows how knots in one's own family history can be loosened and how changes can be made. So it was also interesting in this example that he and his father did not have a good relation, and there was something in between them. And by the work he does and understanding what happened in the family, then the father and son, they become closer together, and they could develop then a good father-son relationship. So what are the social psychological mechanisms of trauma transference? In general, in a society can be that we're passing on a culture of fear and distrust, and there is intergenerational poverty and deprivation, and the suffering from racism and structural discrimination. Yeah, there's also something that could explain a little bit how it goes on with this transference of trauma from one generation to the next, with what is called the epigenetics, and the epigenetic is something that is around the DNA that makes the different genes active or inactive, and the epigenetic changes in the DNA may influence also the regulation of our stress hormones. And they can then increase the risk for unusual behavior or even mental diseases. There are some research about this still done with animals, not so much with us as human beings, but maybe there's some can give us some idea how there on a biological level it functions, that trauma is transferred from one generation to the next. And there is a famous experiment with mice that were conditioned with electroshock on cherry blossom fragrance, also in the following generations showed fear reaction when exposed to cherry blossom, even if they were not traumatized or not, they did not receive electroshocks, but the two next generations also they had a fear reaction to this fragrance. On the other hand, what we also take into account is that the resilience could be transferred from one generation to the next as well. It's not only that negative, we all see that there are negative effects that are transferred, but there's also maybe what we call post-traumatic growth, and what we call also that also the mechanism of resilience can be improved in such families or communities, and there may be an intense search for healing. There's a higher consciousness for such social justice in those communities, families and communities. So what can help? It's on the one side individual trauma therapy, it's therapy with families, it's acknowledgement of indigenous wisdom, social justice, and political awareness of the transgenerational effects of violence and war. And if we look at our methods we have available in IoPT-oriented psychotrauma therapy, that means we can help once a person's true identity to grow. We can make our surviving strategies more conscious. We can help to dissolve from entangled identifications. We can put attributions under questions. And in the end, we can do something that interrupts the transgenerational transmission of trauma. Thank you.